Welcome, everyone. My name is Veena Nachibola, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event titled Canada, Japan, and U.S. Relations in the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be doing this together with the David Lamb Center at the Simon Fraser University and with the generous support of the Consulate General of Japan here in Vancouver. This is also the second event that we're organizing as part of the series to commemorate 95th year anniversary of the Japan-Canada relations. The first one took place in September. I think a number of you were here, so thank you very much for coming back to continue the discussions on how Japan and Canada, and in this case US, also can deepen partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Before I go too much further, let me also acknowledge that the location we're gathered on today is on traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're grateful to Canada's Indigenous people for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, and play. As I was mentioning, this is a public event as well. Everything is on the record. So there will be a portion that will involve question and answer and comments from you all. We just want you to be aware of the fact that there will be a recording of this event, which will be available on our website and also on social media. So, and of course, everything that the speakers will be saying will also be on the record. And we are really excited to have a truly terrific panel of experts to lead the conversation this evening. We have folks who've traveled from faraway places, including Hawaii in the US, and I think it's Christy who has brought this beautiful sunshine and weather to Vancouver, so we're very grateful for that as well. And of course, we also have folks who've traveled from the US by way of Japan, so in the case of Adam, Professor Adam Liff, and we have dear friends of the foundation, someone who everybody in this room probably knows, Yves Tiberghien, Professor Tiberghien, who's among his many qualifications is also Distinguished Fellow with the Foundation, so we're thrilled to have him with us on the panel. They will each speak from a slightly different perspective. The way we have structured tonight's event is we'll have first Professor Christy Valera, who will speak about Japan's foreign policy, specifically what changes we're seeing in the last few years and how Japan is engaging in the region as well as globally. Then we'll have Professor Tiberghien speak a little bit about Canada and Japan relations, Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy. He'll offer some specific views on what can be done to deepen that partnership between Canada and Japan as part of the second year of the implementation of the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And he's promising to be a little bit controversial, which is exactly what we want, and push us through some of his ideas and recommendations. Then we'll have two terrific responders, so people who will actually comment on everything that they have heard from Yves and Christy. And for that, we have Professor Adam Liff from Georgetown University. He's also a visiting scholar at a number of other universities, which he'll mention, but the point here is that we'll have a somewhat of a US perspective, someone who has been looking at how Japan is positioning itself in particular with respect to Taiwan and possible Taiwan contingencies and peace and stability in the region, and what powers other than the US and China can be doing in the region. So really sort of exciting set of insights as well as reactions to what you'll be hearing. And then last but not least, we have Professor Yoshi Kawasaki from Simon Fraser University. We're excited to have him with us again. He was part of the first panel in September, and he'll offer further reflections again on what the Canadian angle can be in this and what are specific areas for partnerships. So that's in terms of what will be happening with the panel. And then after each of the speakers presents their initial comments, we'll have a moderated exchange among them. So really an opportunity for everybody to react, and then a Q&A with all of you. So the program is meant to go until 7 o'clock. We'll try to stay on time, in a perfect tradition. In Japan, everything is on time, so we'll try to run like Japanese trains, although we might be just a couple of minutes behind. So already, but with that, I believe I've sort of said most of the opening things that I need to mention for now. What I'll do is I'll invite Christy for you to come up and maybe do your opening remarks first, and then we'll proceed. Thank you.
Aloha, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so great to be here to speak with you at a time when I think there's so much to discuss about Japan, the U.S., and Canada, and there's a lot of convergence actually in perspectives between the countries. I think this is in part because all three are facing really serious challenges internationally and also domestically. They face their own problems, but they also share values and interests that bring them together. And it's clear that working together potentially has the benefit of bringing them all closer to their shared aims. So I was asked to speak about Japanese foreign policy, which is a very broad remit. So in my remarks today, my intention is basically to highlight some broad themes that span security, economics, and other issues in order to help frame the discussions that we'll have in the later panel discussion and in the Q&A. So I won't talk explicitly about Japan-Canada relations right now, which will be ably covered by the next speaker, I believe. But I'm sure you'll fill up elements in my discussion of Japan that really resonate with discussions that you're having here in Canada, and that are also present in discussions that are occurring in the US. So just to start off, I would say that it's clear that Japan is very much aware of the complexities of this moment of time. Basically, we're in a moment when cooperation and division are intricately intertwined in countries' relationships with one another. So this is particularly clear, for example, when we think about Japan as a country that considers itself to be on the front lines of the rise of China. So that means both in terms of being deeply economically interdependent with China, and in terms of experiencing increasingly assertive behavior from China on the other hand. There are many countries who face these kinds of complexities, and the world is increasingly characterized by intensifying geopolitical competition. So Japan is trying to figure out how to navigate the opportunities and challenges that it has in order to best serve its national interests and its people. So with that, let me move into my discussion of the broad themes that I see. So there have been a lot of updates to numerous government documents and a number of statements that have been released or updated over the last couple of years that lay out the thinking of Japanese policymakers. And looking at these and talking to folks in Hawaii, where I'm based, where there's a lot of thinking about the Indo-Pacific, it's really clear that Japan is using a multi-layered approach to its foreign policy. It's trying to use all of the tools it has, diplomatic, economic, defense, technological, soft power, other things, and is trying to mobilize them domestically, bilaterally, unilaterally, and multilaterally. It's also trying to find a balance between advocating for inclusivity and broad-based cooperation in some areas, while trying to address its very real threats and cooperating with smaller groups of like-minded countries and others. So I think that we today would like to highlight 4 major themes. The first is strengthening the international order. I think this is something that Japan has talked about increasingly. For example, Prime Minister Kishida gave a speech in March of last year, updating one of Japan's core foreign policy platforms, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, in which he really emphasized the idea that the international community is at a historical turning point where there's a lack of consensus on what the international order should be, which is a sentiment that I think many share. There's a lot of consensus on the lack of consensus. So, for example, Japan is very concerned about the deterioration of the international economic order due to the rise of protectionism and populism in many countries, which have stressed a trade system that was already facing many challenges, and which have led countries like the U.S., who are once its strongest supporters, to turn away. Japan is also deeply concerned about the international security order and the ways that countries like Russia and China are challenging existing institutions. So in particular, the war in Ukraine marked a unilateral change of the status quo by Russia that Japan felt could set an alarming precedent for other parts of the world, with the example that we've been discussing most being potential Chinese aggression against Taiwan. So this crisis of the international order really has the potential to impact negatively the security and prosperity of Japan, which is why we hear it emphasized over and over in Japanese statements and policies. So, for example, it's the subject of the first pillar of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, which is principles for peace and rules for prosperity. And the kinds of principles that Japan hopes the international community should uphold include respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, transparency, and rule of law. So to strengthen this, what is Japan doing? It's trying to bolster the international institutions that served it well during the post-World War II period, such as the WTO and the UN. It's reaching out to countries in the Global South and elsewhere whose support is necessary for the international order if it's to succeed. succeed. But on the other hand, Japan is also very much aware that some existing institutions can no longer cope with the changing international environment. So it's also trying to address these gaps with newer minilateral groupings such as the Quad and a host of other bilateral and minilateral dialogues with like-minded countries who value similar goals and principles. So this is a big topic, the international order, but it's something really that Japan feels is strongly related to its existential concerns. The second theme I'd like to highlight is promoting economic connectivity while also protecting national economic security. So these two things are not necessarily totally compatible, but they are very important, the balance of the two. So Japan clearly sees economic interdependence as essential for economic growth, which is why it cares so much about the international economic order that I just mentioned. But yet, as it says in its free and open Indo-Pacific vision, the kind of economic connection that relies solely on one country could be a breeding ground for political vulnerability, such as economic coercion. And then we've also seen in recent years disruptions from pandemics or disasters, and so there's a lot of vulnerability in this interdependence too. So thus Japan aims to increase its own options and increase the options of other countries. So it's not just about interdependence or growth, it's also about diversification and protection. So for example, what is Japan doing to keep trade integration going despite the stagnation of the WTO it's signed on to, and in some cases played a leading role in regional trade arrangements such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in the Indo-Pacific. It's also negotiated a number of bilateral agreements with various countries over the past several years and had done so before. Japan is also part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which, although it does not include market access, furthers connectivity on supply chains, clean economy, fair economy, etc. And if we look beyond trade, we really see that Japan has a whole host of initiatives involving things like official development assistance, infrastructure, entrepreneurship, and digital connectivity. And it has a lot of, again, minilateral, small formats in which it's trying to advance these aims. For example, it has a number of different initiatives with the U.S. It's also met trilaterally with the U.S. and South Korea recently to discuss supply chains. It's met with the Quad to discuss supply chains, infrastructure, and critical and emerging technologies. And similar discussions are also occurring in other parts of the world with Europe and with India, for example. So domestically, Japan has also made a lot of different kinds of investments and tried to give itself more policy tools with which to cope with this increasingly complex economic environment. So it passed an Economic Security Promotion Act a couple of years ago, which sets out new legislation to strengthen the security of critical infrastructure, again, address supply chain stability, facilitate cooperation on new technologies between the private and public sector, and also protect patents. And these are just a few of the things that it's doing. So economics and economic security is a huge emphasis. The third thing I'd like to talk about is bolstering defense capabilities and enhancing security cooperation. So it's interesting if you look at the national security strategy of Japan, because it also sees the world at a historical inflection point. And, quote, in the face of the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II, end quote. So essentially, Japan is trying to protect its national interests, to maintain its sovereignty and independence, to defend its territorial integrity and protect its people, while also promoting economic prosperity and the international order, which it sees also as essential to its security. If you think about Japan's neighborhood, of course, it's clear that it faces a number of security threats from China, potentially from North Korea, and from Russia most recently. The most complex strategic challenge is China, which is simultaneously, as I mentioned, Japan's largest trade partner, and also a country that is increasing its defense spending, and from the perspective of Japan, attempting to unilaterally change the status quo in the maritime and air domains, for example, in the East and South China Seas. And if we think more broadly about what's going on in the world, we can see that the maritime, outer space, and cyber domains have all become increasingly contested, congested, and competitive, as people say, which also poses a lot of challenges for Japan, even more broadly than in its neighborhood. So Japan still sees itself as having an exclusive defense-oriented policy and has a number of restrictions on what it can do. But due to the changes in its security environment, it has embarked upon a number of notable expansions of its defense policy. It's aiming to strengthen its own capabilities domestically to the point where it can take primary responsibility for dealing with invasions. Other goals include cross-domain capabilities and acquiring counter-strike capabilities. And it's also reinforcing its own defense protection domestically and its technology base. And to support all of this, Japan has resolved to increase its spending to an unprecedented 2% of GDP. That being said, a lot of questions remain about how Japan would use this money and whether it will actually be able to meet or sustain this kind of spending goal. And if you are familiar with Japan, you'll also know that the weak yen has created a lot of problems for spending estimates. And that's also important to remember that all of this is subject to limitations. So due to its constraints, which I mentioned, to use any capabilities, Japan's national survival still has to be threatened. No other means of addressing the problem or threat need to exist, and force must be limited to the minimum necessary. So there are similar terms. Externally, Japan's aiming to enhance its alliance with the U.S., which remains the key pillar of its security policy. And we could talk in detail about that, but improving coordination and interoperability, deepening cooperation across cyberspace and other domains, etc. And it's also expanding cooperation with additional partners in Asia, Europe, and beyond, including with Canada, and bilaterally, trilaterally through the Quad, and with the US, and India and Australia, with NATO, and again with a variety of other countries in these small formats. So it's interesting to note that actually the lines between US-Japan cooperation and cooperation with other partners is becoming increasingly blurred because the US itself is also trying to network its allies and partners in these ways. So, it is a different game when it comes to security cooperation in many ways. It's starting to change, although, again, the US-Japan alliance is the core pillar. The last theme I want to talk about is promoting cooperation in non-traditional and human security. So Japan has a really long history of thinking about security in an expansive way beyond traditional military security. And that's now something I think that has a lot of resonance in the world among other countries. So if we think about health security, we've all experienced the devastating consequences the pandemic can have. So Japan has tried to promote more broadly universal health coverage and to improve infectious disease surveillance. In terms of environmental security, Japan has put forward a number of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience initiatives, particularly in places like the Pacific Islands. It's also tried to promote food security and providing aid to vulnerable countries in the events of disasters or to increase stockpiles, for example. And we also know that there are a variety of non-traditional security threats from things like piracy, human trafficking, and transnational crime that Japan has been involved in the region. So I'll conclude with some brief observations and a few notes about opportunities and challenges for the future, although I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. So across these different themes that I mentioned, so the international order, economic connectivity, traditional security, and non-traditional security, it seems that Japan is clearly trying to support broad multilateralism in the international system while also filling the gaps with these more minilateral targeted initiatives with like-minded partners. Relatedly, it also has the conundrum of trying to balance embracing inclusivity and cooperation in some areas while protecting against threats in others. So very concretely, Japan faces challenges in simultaneously trying to address its regional security concerns regarding, for example, China and North Korea, which push it into deeper relationships with the US and like-minded countries, while trying to somehow bolster support for the international order, which requires reaching out to partners in places like the Global South, who are likely to be alienated by framing things in terms of geopolitics and don't really want to be involved in US-China competition. But again, all of these partners are necessary if you really care about the strength of the international order. So it's really striking if you look even at the documents that Japan has put out. If you look at the Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision, it very much emphasizes that it's an inclusive concept, and it actually includes the sentence, "We do not exclude anyone, we do not create camps, and we do not impose values." And that really is admirable as an aspirational vision, when you're trying to aim for a world where diverse nations coexist and you can live together under the rule of law. And so a lot of the cooperation that Japan puts forward is in this kind of inclusive area, especially when you think about climate change or health or these kinds of initiatives. But at the same time, if we look at the national security strategy that Japan released, China is explicitly described as an unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge in ensuring the peace and security of Japan and the peace and stability of the international community. And in order to address this, Japan should respond with its comprehensive national power and in cooperation with its ally, like-minded countries and others, which clearly suggests that cooperation among camps of some like-minded countries is necessary in some cases. So this is not necessarily unique to Japan. I would actually say that this tension between cooperation and division is one that basically all countries are dealing with now. And it makes a lot of sense to aim for inclusivity while also drawing closer to the countries that you trust. But I think recognizing this is very key to understanding why we see apparent contradictions at times in Japan's own statements about its foreign policy, and to understand how Japan is trying to navigate a complex security environment across all of the four things that I mentioned. We'll talk more, I'm sure, about opportunities and challenges, but very briefly, I think that if you think about all of the things I just mentioned, it's clear that Japan's eager to work with like-minded partners because many of the challenges that it faces are really challenges it can't solve by itself. They're very broad challenges. So Japan's thinking about these issues now. It's very engaged in trying to build and participate in broader coalitions, and it's clear that countries like Canada share its interests. So if there ever was a time that was ripe for dialogue in small groups of countries about what they can do, this is that time. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of opportunity for good ideas and building momentum. And there are a lot of problems to work on together. On the other hand, there are of course a lot of challenges, and that these are very difficult problems. And so even the matter of how to prioritize them, how to resource them, et cetera, is really difficult. I think more broadly, as somebody who works a lot on regional institutional architecture, there's also this question of how to build up from small cooperation. Where do you go from a bilateral or trilateral or quadrilateral conversation about international order or values or basically anything, supply chain resilience? How do you build up that consensus that doesn't exist right now about the international order and really create an environment that is conducive to prosperity and security? And then, of course, I can't end without saying that we all have our own domestic political issues, and Japan is, of course, not alone in that. But there are a whole host of things that always pull attention from foreign policy and, are often considered to be more immediate concerns. And so whether it's in Japan or the U.S. or elsewhere, it's a challenge, particularly for democracies, to focus on difficult long-term challenges and to keep those aims in mind. But there is also, as I said, a lot of opportunity. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the next speaker's comments.
Thank you so much, Christy, for that really great seed setter and an overview of Japan's foreign policy priorities. I think the 4 issues that you mentioned, the kind of 4 buckets of strengthening multilateralism and rule of law, as well as dealing with economic security and inclusivity and connectivity, and the 2 kind of security, the human security and the hard security, is a really nice way of being able to frame the issues. And especially thanks for showing some of the apparent contradictions, but I think it's useful for us to explore why these apparent contradictions between inclusivity and cooperation on one side and a recognition that some cooperation with like-minded countries and the competition and the strategic framing of China as the primary threat both to the region and globally to the rules-based international order, I think is a really interesting one. And I hope that in the discussion we'll unpack how much of that is an issue of tone and language and framing, especially when dealing with Southeast Asian countries, for instance, who are very allergic to the idea of having to choose and or framing of everything as competition, and how much of that is actually practically implemented in the policy. So I hope we can unpack that a little bit. And of course, when you frame kind of the priorities for Japan's foreign policy, the 4 issues would be very familiar to a Canadian audience, right? We can easily say that those are also the issues that Canada is prioritizing, perhaps less with the 3rd on hard security, but certainly on rules-based order, on connectivity versus dealing with economic security, national security concerns. And then the final point on human security, there's a lot of synergies there, and I hope Eve, you can help us explore kind of how is Canada looking at this and the Canada-Japan dynamics, especially as part of the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And we couldn't be more privileged in having a speaker on this topic who's as best positioned as Eve, because he was actually involved as part of the advisory group that Minister Jolie had put forward to advise her on the Indo-Pacific Strategy when it was being finalized. So Eve has some insider perspective on why some of the things ended up in the strategy, and he can now speak to where we are 1 year on. So Eve, without further ado, please.
Thank you very much, Nina and Christy. I'm also jet lagged, so I just flew from Taiwan. I'm on this year on sabbatical, spending the year between Taiwan and Japan, also in Korea, Singapore, and in the region, as well as in Ottawa, actually. I will try to reflect some of the conversations I've heard, especially in Tokyo, but also in Ottawa, in my remarks. So the key points, Christy has already put a lot of emphasis on this, is Japan is going through a very big transformation. A transformation that's actually greater than what Canada is doing, so in terms of degree and intensity. It's a military transformation, diplomatic, also an industrial policy revival. and trade, economic security, transformation. All this within very few years. And Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has had also a huge impact on Japan, almost surprisingly. But it could almost be said to be greater than on Canada. Second point, there is a sort of very happy honeymoon moment between Japan and Canada, or rapprochement, around the IPS that Canada has announced and been working on. Because to a large extent, the Canadian IPS echoes the FOIP developed by Japan. And clearly everyone knows that the leader in Indo-Pacific strategies has been Japan, as the pioneer and the leader. And there's a lot of echo and knowledge of that FOIP strategy in Canada when announcing the IPS. Third key point, there is a lot of mutual interest and activities around military, diplomatic, security aspects, as well as economic security. However, there is room for much more serious activity and investment into the relationship at both sides. There's a lot of mutual congratulation, but I think there's room for a lot more, if the common agenda is to be followed. So I'm then going to say a few more words on Japan, a few points that complement what Christy said, and then a few points on Canada and the IPS, and then getting to a few proposals and a couple of big questions that both countries face, and with room for a lot more cooperation along those two questions. So on Japan, just the military transformation is historic. Japan has been limiting itself to 1% military budget over GDP since the creation of the SDF, mid-1950s. And it's been flat at 1%. And the military budget of Japan was flat for 20 years because there was less growth. And suddenly, it has announced a goal of going to 2%. Now, it's still a struggle because while the public supports a stronger defense posture, they don't support increasing taxes to pay for it. So far the effort is to find money elsewhere, but it ends up being in debt. So this is a bit fragile to go to such a big investment without a public support for paying for it. But nonetheless, the commitment is huge. So it's the biggest change in Japanese military posture since World War II. It all happened since the invasion of Ukraine. It's also a strong leader in Indo-Pacific strategies and a pioneer in many things that other partners are doing, including Canada. Second, Japan has just gone through an investment in a battery of new trade instruments. In fact, Japan has led the way, including both in responding to geopolitical risks, to social risk, and to the Trump 1 administration. Has gone in a more strategic way and more thorough way than almost any country. So that included taking the leadership of the TPP, turning it into the final CPTPP, reviving and finishing very rapidly the EU-Japan partnership, still being active in the RCEP, which includes China, and being part of finishing the RCEP, getting a US-Japan trade agreement, and so on and so on. And there's all kind of other activities. So major piece there. In the last 2 years, we also see a strong cooperation with Korea. Now the ball is really coming out of Korea, but Japan is moving with it. And Japan-Korea-U.S. triangle that's more cooperative and active than in decades. So that is a game changer in the region. Strong investment in the Quad, which again was initially a proposal from Japan. India also claimed it's part of that proposing, but it goes back to Abe's first speech in 2007 in India. And a very strong and upgraded relationship with Australia. So Canada should look at that. It's a relationship that's been more than upgraded than the Japan-Canada relationship with a military component, etc. And there is discussion through Australia, but others as well, of Japan cooperating in part of the new AUKUS, at least the cyber pillar, the second pillar. It's not there yet, but it's under discussion and it could well happen. So, it's all happening at the same time in very few years. there is a very strong deployment, accelerated deployment of foreign policy by Japan in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So Japan is very, very present with very strong trust relationships. And so for Canada, that becomes a critical player to get intelligence and to learn how to operate more actively in those regions. And I should also mention Africa. At least East Africa, Japan has been active in increasing its relationship. The other very, very interesting point is we are living through the revival of industrial policy, which was announced for dead back in early 90s or late 80s. And just to give you an example, it's focused heavily on semiconductors and AI, but also critical minerals, and soon we're going to see a lot on green tech. But to just give you a number, the new investments by TSMC with first tranche, second tranche in Kumamoto is coming to $20 billion, and Japan is paying about half of that, 50%. So TSMC is putting 10 billion, Japan is putting 10 billion. And the speed of disbursement by Tokyo is very rapid, much more than the US and Arizona. So the TSMC plant in Arizona is moving slower than expected. Kumamoto plant has just opened February 24th. And everyone is saying in Taiwan and Japan how amazing it has been, how fast, all the muscle, the industrial muscle, industrial policy muscle has been revived. And there is great excitement. Also, it's become a catalyst for a lot of capital flow into Japan by the private sector, both Japanese and foreign. So there's a sense that Japan is back as a semiconductor superpower. There's still a risk. Industrial policy can get things wrong. Japan did it and did some mistakes in the 80s. But there's really a sense of happening. We hear it a lot in Taiwan, talking to some former minister, but we hear it in Japan. And of course, it has revived. There are many parts of the ecosystem that existed in Japan with niche technologies and on ground wafers and a lot of things. All this is being put together around this investment. And there's several other initiatives that are very significant. So this is a big deal, very, very big deal. Korea is watching too and is doing a lot of things. And Canada is not yet at scale, right? If Canada wants to be a player here, there's a lot to take very seriously. This is moving super fast. All this is happening due to new tools that have enabled a very strong Prime Minister leadership that all came into play over the last few years with administrative reforms as well as electoral system reforms. So we have a much stronger institution of the Prime Minister, and the Conte, the PMO, used to have initially 200 staff, less than 10 years ago it was capped at 600. Now we're upward from 3,000, going to 4,000, with a lot of new institutions being created under the PMO. So imagine a PMO of that size, right? I'm still struck in Canada how small PMO is, or how small the staffing of the minister is, right? With very significant decisions to make with very few staff. So Japan is like going with all this. That allows that very strategic change of posture. But we should also say that there's fragility behind all this. If we read all the speeches, we see all this. The fragility is we have a very weak prime minister who most likely may not survive the LDP election in September. So it would be very hard for him to survive. So most likely we'll have a new PM in September. We have demographic crisis. We've just seen the lowest numbers in a long time. We have also an economy that was forecasted to be in recession this year. It seems that it's just going to make it at 0%, but still it's not an economy that yet is ready to sustain the kind of foreign policy investment that are happening. So those are some question marks here. And then there's the public question, right? The public is not fully evolving as fast as the foreign policy posture is. And so, in Japan, often public opinion can follow either leadership or crisis. So it may take a crisis but in conversation, all my conversation in Japan, clearly the public opinion is not ready to really think that Japan could be a battlefront in a Taiwan contingency with bases being bombed and that kind of thing. No one is ready for this yet in the public awareness. On China, a footnote here, which is relevant for Canada. Abe was interesting. Abe is the great balancer. I mean, initially, he's really the one who initiated all the things we're discussing. So he's a critical prime minister. But he was doing, at the same time, more robust defense, more alliance strengthening, more emphasis on rule of law, etc. But also economic engagement with China. And he was pushing for RCEP, and he had a very advanced and thorough agenda with China in 2019 around the G20 with 10 points. So he was trying to do a very interesting balancing. And under Kishida, we see the end of that. Kishida, first of all, has been all in with the G7 on Ukraine and against Russia, which is new. Japan, in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, did not go with the G7 and was taking a very careful posture with Russia, always in the hope of getting back the Hokkaido, the 4 islands. Second thing about Kishida, we see a much stronger posture on China that is less balanced by any economic balancing. There is much less going on, even though there was still a trilateral summit with Korea, with the Prime Minister, now with Xi Jinping. There's still some diplomatic engagement and the bilateral summits and around the G20 and all this, but it's much less proactive than under Abe, who was kind of doing this at the same time. And we see a flood of disinvestment by Japanese firms out of China, which didn't happen under Abe. So the numbers were kind of stable. Japan was still 25% dependent for its trade, for its export on Japan by the end of 2021. But in 2023, I don't have the figures yet, but this is going down. 2022, we already saw it go down by 2 or 3 points, and it's more likely to have come down further this year. And we hear from many companies that there is a lot of exit going on. So that's new, which reduces the trade dependence, but also can affect the leverage, right, in the relationship that Japan has had. So now, turning to Canada, and some proposals and things that I think are still missing. So the good news is strong alignment right now diplomatically between Canada and Japan around the IPS. So it's a very good time for our ambassador in Tokyo. He has access everywhere. He has a great time. Of course, he's also fluent in Japanese and very, very savvy with Japan. But this is a good time. There's strong interest and investment by Japanese firms, especially in LNG. I see Mitsubishi is here, so they can tell much more. There's a lot of interest in some investments like this in Canada. I'm sure there was interest in lithium. I don't know where things are, because in Canada it's expensive to develop. But all those resources that Canada has, there's very strong Japanese interest. There is also, formally I can say that there is interest in doing a much higher level, track 2, track 1.5 diplomatic dialogue between Japan and Canada that could be around discussing the Indo-Pacific and even China. And I see that there's room to do something at that level. That's not happening yet. That would be at the highest levels. And it could be even triangular, right, involving a third party. Probably not the US, because both have very, very strong bilateral with the US, but there's room to bring a European partner, for example. And there's demand for that. There is expectation in Japan. There's gratefulness for the Canadian Navy presence, but I think they'll be happier with even more, because we are limited in Canada by our defense budget. So personally, and that's purely personal, I think Canada will have to move to 2% very quickly, under pressure from the US. But why not do it on our own rather than be taken to the water by force, right? And a lot of it could go toward the Navy, and there is room and expectation toward much more presence. Because now we can, spend some money and pay fuel and send in one extra ship, but we're still very limited. I mean, you probably all know that the Canadian forces are very, very stretched and underfunded. In terms of Southeast Asia, they're talking in Southeast Asia, in the region, and also hearing from Japanese sources. I think there is expectation for much more real, much more robust presence by Canada. That's more sustained. Right now, there's a lot of talking and claiming, but not yet enough resources and resources on the ground. And informally, I hear from both. You know, the Japanese are very good relays as well to hear what's happening in South Asia for Canadians. So it's a great resource, but there is probably a bit of fatigue with some emphasis on Canadian values and much more preference for boots on the ground, you know, investment on the ground, economic presence on the ground, and stuff like that, and involvement in development project and infrastructure. We know we have infrastructure budget in the IPS, but this is what I hear. India, Japan has a very strong, very robust relationship with India, which grows by the day. I think they see it as strategic. They think, and I think they think, and many people think, Canada will not have a very robust Indo-Pacific strategy going forward without a very strong partnership with India. And Japan could help in that process. In general, I think Canada has room to speak more quietly, but have a stronger gut and stronger money. So that's, and that would be applauded by Japan. So more presence. Now, two big questions for both countries. Those are the two defining questions that will shape the next 2-3 years. And I think there's room for a lot of engagement between the two countries, given the alignment. The first one is the crisis over the economic order, globalization, trade, and all this. Daniel Roderick just had a very powerful piece in the IMF this month. He's arguing that essentially our global economic order is on the brink, right? Basically, I can say now, the liberal international order is dying. You know, it's ending. And it's ending because there is no more support for it in major countries, including the U.S. Because of social crisis, social cohesion crisis. That's what's driving the populist anger, right, and the drive toward Trump. But also because of securitization and weaponization of interdependence and economic security. The problem with economic security and weaponization and securitization of everything is that it's a slippery slope. You know, it's nice to have a hard, a strong wall around a small yard, high fence, small yard. The problem is security folks are now in control and they don't stop at a small yard. And the logic is a spillover logic because there is tit-for-tat response and there's no agreement on protectionism. You know, what one country decides they need for social reason or geopolitical reason is not agreed by anyone else in general. And so everyone then responds. They feel threatened, they respond, and then the first country responds back. So there is a danger of unraveling of the economic order. And so that's the question, how everyone will have to work very hard to downscale a bit globalization, to go away from hyper-globalization, to be more savvy with social issues, to give more space to government, to deal with social inequality and dislocation, and also to find a way to move on economic security and weaponization in a controlled way. Because if we move into an uncontrolled phase, we risk some new kind of 1930s. So we have a lot of coal. The IMF, Gita Gopinath, Deputy Director, has just made a lot of interesting points on that, just published a very provocative piece in Foreign Policy. Adam Tooze has talked about it. This is a frontier question, and for Japan and Canada, as trading nations, is critical. Many countries have to think hard and invest in gaming how we can move from phase A to phase B without having a systemic collapse. The LIO is being redefined, renegotiated, competed over. The question is whether we can reach a new partially negotiated agreement, or whether instead we're going to a rupture and mega crisis. That's question number one, huge. And question number two for Japan and Canada and many more countries is the possible, likely return of Donald Trump, with the agenda that we can all read, right? The agenda for America First 2.0 is written by think tanks in Washington and elsewhere in Texas. We can read it. The Economist has called it the biggest crisis in the world order. The Eurasia Institute, Ian Bremmer, has put it as #1 systemic risk for the world. There is a risk of a 10% tariff to everyone, including Canada and Japan, by the US, 60% tariff on China, which will lead to a lot of secondary questions because so much of that trade now goes through South Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. So will then Trump put 60% on Vietnam, South Asia, and everybody? I mean, it's not a simple question like doing 60% on one country. So if we get maximum Trump, and he's bent on getting out of NATO, getting out of WTO, getting out of many institutional global order, as he says he is, and he doesn't have people restraining him as in the Trump one, then what will happen? Will there be a global coalition to hold some core institutions together to avoid a collapse? Will Japan and Canada be at the heart of that dialogue? I can tell you that when I'm in Tokyo, when I have high conversation at a pretty high level, when we get to Trump, usually the ice is staring up at the sky, and no one is ready, and it's a scary proposal. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done at that time. The EU is very involved thinking about it. I mean, the EU is even more terrified because they are waking up to a world where Russia could swallow Ukraine and threaten the Baltic countries and Poland. And while the US is pulling out completely and leaving Europe to its own fate, a resurgent populist Trump that wants to really target the EU as much as China, and a Middle East crisis. And of course, it's not like China he's also not a worry. So this is a pretty worrying moment for Europe. But will there be? However, when I was in Singapore, at pretty high level, I was still hearing optimistic view. So look, if the US pulls out of globalization, and everyone else will come together and save the system, and we'll do globalization without the US. So Singaporeans say, no problem, we can fix it. We can fix anything. So for optimism, go to Singapore, or go to even Vietnam or Thailand. I see a lot of optimism out there. And Delhi. Delhi is now, they think they can, they have huge leverage and they can solve anything. Just wanted to put those controversial things on the table. Thank you.
That was really fantastic, and thank you for ending on an optimistic note. Having just been to Singapore, New Delhi, Tokyo, myself in this past 3 weeks, I can definitely concur that in New Delhi and in Singapore, people are quite optimistic and feel that they can, in fact, deal with Trump too, and that, especially in New Delhi, the energy and the confidence is really palpable. But in Tokyo, I agree with you, there's quite a bit of preoccupation with what Trump could look like, and a serious concern. And I think lots of money is already being spent on lobbyists to try to figure out how to best deal with that eventuality. So thank you also for laying out two big questions that hopefully we can unpack as part of the question, as part of our panel discussion. The idea of how do we deal with this new trend of globalization light, or some call it deglobalization or reglobalization, and then of course how do we deal with US that may be less of a constructive actor in all of these questions if Mr. Trump is elected. So those two questions, we'll park them for a second, but maybe I'll now invite Professor Adam Liff to offer some initial comments. You have the advantage of having heard both speakers kind of choose to take the conversation in whatever direction you'd like, and maybe add some perspectives from the US, given your vantage point and your teaching experience there, but also anything else that you'd like to comment on at this stage. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be here, and it's an honor to share the stage with my colleagues up here. It's my first ever visit to Vancouver, so I'm very, very pleased to be here. So I want to just be very clear that I am offering an American perspective, not the American perspective or the US government's perspective. I'm here in my capacity as an independent funded scholar. So what I'd like to do, as my marching orders suggested, is briefly respond to some of the remarks of my esteemed colleagues, and then offer perhaps some additional commentary. And I'll try to be very brief. Wonderful remarks. Covered a tremendous amount of ground, so I'll be very selective with how I respond. But I think one of the important points she made is this idea that cooperation and division is an increasingly prominent feature of bilateral relations, And I think Japan's an important case in point of this as it engages China and, to use her term, figures out how to navigate this very complicated, multifaceted relationship. As I often tell my students, Japan does not have the luxury or the option of picking up and moving to the Eastern Pacific or picking up and moving to the Western or Eastern Atlantic. That's a reality, that's an unchanging reality. And I think, as my colleague Mike Green and others have argued, Japan is in many ways kind of at the vanguard of figuring out how to strike this balance. Never getting it perfectly right, but adjusting in response to changing external stimulus, including from the United States and elsewhere. And I think that's a very, very important thing to think about. There's a lot of very simplistic black or white discourse out there. The US or China, right? Black or white. Nobody is choosing in that stark of fashion. And we're all trying to figure out a very, very nuanced set of policies or strategies, if you want to use that term, for navigating these difficult trade-offs. Christy, at 2 points, and she had 4 major themes, and I heard her explicitly mention twice in discussing Japan's strategy, this idea that for Japan, you can read it in black and white, that the world has reached a historic turning point. A lot of the concerns, especially in the security space in Japan, significantly predate Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's not forget that 2022, North Korea also set an all-time record for missile tests in terms of advancing a lot of very scary technology in that regard as well. But Ukraine was a turning point, especially in the way that Japanese leaders talked about it. Prime Minister Kishida was at the vanguard in talking about linkages between Europe and Asia. Ukraine today, East Asia tomorrow is a line that can be traced back to a speech by Prime Minister Kishida, and I think a lot of that has been internalized. When I think about strategy, when I teach about strategy, you have a long-term objective, and the goal of strategists is to identify a set of policies that they believe to maximize the likelihood that that objective can be achieved. What seems very clear in the rhetoric coming out of Tokyo, and as reflected in the national security strategies and other documents that have come out in recent years, is that we are at this turning point. And if the diagnosis of the challenges changes, the prescription, i.e. policy, needs to change. And I would never in a million years claim to be an expert on your wonderful country, but I think one question that emerges from my reading of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is that does Canada share this sense of urgency? That there's something fundamentally and powerfully new, and that Canada's policies and strategies need to adapt in response. Christy, Eve, and I, Yoshi as well, I'm sure, have heard for years people calling on Japan to increase its defense spending. This is not a new idea. The idea that East Asia's security environment, that the environment that surrounds Japan is unprecedentedly challenging, is not new. But something changed in 2022, and the policy and the strategy changed in response. So the question I have for colleagues on the panel or the audience more generally is, does Canada's discussion about its own Indo-Pacific strategy reflect a different diagnosis or simply a different prescription? I don't know the answer, but I'd love to have that conversation. Turning to Eve's remarks, again, wonderful remarks, extremely comprehensive. There's so much we could talk about. I thought we might get to the end without the T word coming up, but it did. As it does in every single conversation I've had for the last 6 or 7 years. And I apologize, I'm coming in from Japan, so I'm a bit jet-lagged myself. But when talking to friends and allies and counterparts in Asia, this is, of course, top of mind. A couple of things I'd say in response to that. It's not black or white. It's not about the U.S. leaving or fundamentally reinforcing the local or national order. We're going to be somewhere along a spectrum, regardless of who gets elected. Trump has not won yet. And if I was betting right now, I would say he's probably not going to win. But there's a significantly less than zero chance that that does happen. And friends and allies need to be prepared for either outcome. I don't want to nerd out as a political scientist on how presidents are elected in the United States, but it ain't straightforward. I'm from Georgia, so I'm allowed to use ain't. This election is extraordinarily difficult to predict for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the nature of the Electoral College. The 2020 and 2016 elections were determined by some order between, I forget the exact numbers, but it was several tens of thousands of votes in 3 states in both cases. If the weather is bad in 2 of those states, the result can change. The bottom line is Canada and others need to be prepared for either outcome, but it's by no means a foregone conclusion that the election will go one way or the other. Another thing I also tell, especially when I speak on this issue in Japan, there's an understandable fascination with American politics, but more generally with presidential elections. I was studying at the University of Tokyo when it was Obama-Clinton in the primary, right? And then we had the presidential campaign, constant news coverage. The US president is extraordinarily important, but the US president is not the only individual, and the executive branch is not the only institution that matters. Congress has immense powers, and when it chooses to assert itself, historically we can think about the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, there are a number of other examples, especially on the resourcing side, it can assert itself. And so that's also another thing to pay attention to, not just the presidential election, but the congressional election. And also, perhaps less relevant in the hard security space, but when it comes to things that I think many people in this room are probably concerned about, like climate change, subnational actors have extraordinary agency. California, the state of California, I forget what the latest statistics show, but it's certainly a top 10 global economy if California had its own national GDP. It's leading the way. My hometown, Bloomington, Indiana, has its own policy on climate. All around the United States, other actors at the subnational level play an important role. One issue that's really in my wheelhouse on defense, the defense budget came up several times, and just a couple quick things to say. I think the 1% to 2% comparison can often be misleading because your numerator and your denominator are different. When Japan talks about, or when we collectively talk about 1% in the Japanese case, we're talking about the defense budget, Japanese boei-hi, right? When the Japanese government refers to 2%, they're talking about the official defense budget plus a lot of other stuff. And that's why they use the term national security relevant expenditures. So there's this idea out there that got seeded in December 2022 that Japan is doubling its defense budget. It's not. That's not to say that Japan is not embarking on a historic and huge fundamental reinforcement of their defense capabilities. But numbers matter and math matters. And when we talk about the actual defense budget, we're talking about between 55 and 60% of an increase to the defense spending, defense budget between 2022 and 2027. A huge change, don't get me wrong, right? But math matters, especially when we're talking not just about building for the future, but also making up for past neglect, as some people might say. And as even Christy and others have already mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens next in terms of resourcing. Japanese leaders have been a little bit reluctant to be very clear or decisive on how they're going to raise all this money. We have some sense, and Japan's already been increasing its defense budget the last 2 years quite significantly, but there are a lot of open questions, not just about what's going to happen between now and 2027, but also what that means for the deficit, for debt, and also what happens after 2027. So I think that's an important thing to think about. For Canada, right? Canada, I have the figures here. According to figures from NATO, the budget for the Canadian military in 2023 is $36.7 billion, or 1.29% of GDP. That's the 5th lowest in NATO. And I think when we're thinking about what Canada and Japan can do together, what Canada can do with other, not just the US, but other US allies and partners, I think that's going to be a critical variable for obvious reasons. If there's not money there to do certain things, those are not policy options that the Canadian government can use to put in their toolkit when trying to implement the Indo-Pacific Strategy. Right, so going back to that link between diagnosis and prescription, I think defense budget needs to be part of that conversation. On the question of Prime Minister Kishida's longevity, I think it is entirely possible that in the upcoming LDP presidential election that he may not continue, but it's, for the conversation here, I'm not convinced it's a extremely significant variable, because when I think about possible successors, I don't see anyone on the horizon that would fundamentally change Japan's strategic trajectory. Right? I think maybe at the margins we might see some shifts, but at least right now, I don't see any obvious case that there's going to be a major shift, in stark contrast to say what might happen if the leadership changes in Ottawa or the leadership changes in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of consensus on this national security strategy, the national defense build-up plan, and other things. It's no small thing that the major strategic change and the major change to the defense budget happened not under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, but under Prime Minister Kishida. right, who historically, at least within the LDP context, was seen as a more liberal, more kind of, not quite left of center, but much more moderate figure, in contrast to former Prime Minister Abe. And yet, the major change occurred under him. Furthermore, and this is not a popular view, but if you'd like to see it in print, now, I guess, fellow honorary Canadian Philip Lipsey, based in Toronto, and I published a piece in Journal of Japanese Studies in 2023 or 2022 that goes back and looks at Abe's legacy in foreign policy. And very, very important, historically influential figure. But the important point we make, I think, is that there's too much focus, disproportionate focus on a single individual, when what's happening, the variables or the factors that are driving these changes are much greater than any individual or even any individual political party. There's an emerging consensus within Japan on the basic thrust of the trajectory. There's a lot more I could say. I am a university professor after all, but I'll stop there and turn things over to my colleagues.
Well, we're lucky enough to have 4 university professors on the panel, and at least 4 of us are jet lagged, and I consider myself in that same category. So the audience is getting our unvarnished views, no censoring, no talking points, and I think they're already seeing that. So maybe before we go to Professor Kawasaki, I think what was really important, Adam, you mentioned that in Japan people are really obsessed over US presidential elections. Well, in Canada, I'm afraid that's probably even more true, and certainly everybody in the audience, we follow those things quite closely. And similarly, I think the mathematics of the defense spending is another thing that we here in Canada are very familiar with. That's something that's constantly part of the debate, and how much we're spending and how little we're spending, and whether or not we are actually carrying our weight and being a good ally. I think it's a big topic that will resonate with the Canadian audience. But I think the question that you fundamentally pose, which I want Professor Kawasaki to answer, but also Eve and Christy to weigh in on, is whether Canada shares a sense of urgency that's animating so much of the generational shift that we are hearing described as happening in Japan, or whether the diagnosis that is found in the Indo-Pacific Strategy is similar to that that's been put forward by the US, Japan, Australia, and other allies in terms of the threats that are the challenges, particularly with respect to China, but other actors as well, and whether, so kind of the diagnosis, and whether the prescriptions that are found in the Indo-Pacific Strategy actually, again, are aligned and or similar to what we're seeing other allies engage in. I think it's difficult for Canada to play in the same league as the US, of course, but we can compare ourselves to Australia and other key allies in the region, right? And sort of to kind of see how different Canada's presence and efforts in the region are from Australia, UK, France, sort of similar sized economies. So maybe with that, just to add to your tasks, Professor, I'm sure you can do that, and then we'll turn to others as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Quickly, my answer is no to the question you posed.
Excellent.
But let me step back a bit. What we have heard from the panelists are very insightful, penetrating overviews about Japan-Canada relations, or Japan itself, and so on. But what I would like to address, and I don't have a quick answer to this question, is where does Canada fit in this triangle between Japan, United States, and Canada. And we can open up a discussion, but my take-home message to you is please do start thinking about it, because all discussion we hear, not only in this room or outside the room, is whether bilateral, like Canada-Japan, or US-Japan, US-Canada, or some single country focused assessment. And I have no quarrel with everything we've heard. And I agree that President Trump, for the matter, in domestic politics, variable is wild card. We cannot control from outside, whether you're looking at Philippine case or South Korea case. South Korea has a presidential election in 5 years, right? No, second term. We cannot do anything about those events. We just have to adjust ourselves. So, but setting that domestic politics a variable aside. And then looking at this big picture, and then we all know how, we touched on how limited resources we have in Canada. In particular, for Canadian Armed Forces, we hear so much about the budget limitation, budget slash, and so on. And I can keep going to discuss structural and institutional limitations that Canada could or would have to overcome. But acknowledging, understanding these limitations, so my question to you is, where does Canada fit in? Should Canada fit in? Okay. So my temporary answer is as follows. As you are here for first session, I'm much more, if you will, geopolitical thinker. So the way I would package this question and rephrase it as follows. What can Canada do to the Japan-U.S. alliance that's facing, let's say, in the southern front, the Nansei Shoto and the Taiwan front. And then the Canada has been sending, now we have 3 frigate system. But most recently marked by Vice President, sorry, not Vice President, Vice Admiral, strongly hints that that's not sustainable. In fact, we have only 6 operational frigates out of 12, and then 3 to 3, Atlantic and then the Pacific and so on. And then we actually, our Navy is smaller than Australian Navy and South Korean Navy. Okay, so. And on and on. I can keep going, but let's start. What can Canada do? So the way I look at, maybe American friends can show their perspective as well. Canada could play a role for rear end support. Canada may not directly engage itself in Taiwan contingency. In the first session, I was reading that we should have some confidential within the Canadian government, some Taiwan contingency plan beyond war games. For example, what will we do? Are we going to change our historical China policy that we simply took note of the Beijing claim about the Taiwan? In case of the Taiwan contingency, are we going to keep that policy, or are we going to change it? Or what are we going to do for the evacuation plan from Taiwan, or potentially from mainland China and Hong Kong? And so on. We can keep going. Setting that aside, what else can Canada do? The way I was thinking is twofold. Number one, maybe we can do something about continuing Operation Neon in Sea of Japan. Now we are checking North Korea's illegal shipment, but can we switch to the operation against any diversionary action on the part of North Korea and Russia in case of Taiwan contingency? And as you noted, the most recent summit agreement in Camp David between South Korea, United States, Japan, breakthrough in terms of institutionalizing cooperation. And then presumably in case of Taiwan crisis, and then South Korea may not come and join the Japan-U.S. forces, but it might actually try to coordinate in case North Korea would start taking action on Korean Peninsula. So we're looking at 2 fronts theater scenario, and I think governments are acknowledging how to prepare. I don't think Canada would be part of that scheme. On the non, Canada itself would have to think about contingency plans, secret one, ideally coordinate behind the scene with the Japanese and the American or other counterparts. I think that's their job. That in turn reflects my idea that Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy is a peacetime document. We have to prepare for contingency. That's the kind of world we are living in right now. Anyway, so I can keep going, but the basic message is how to package, right? These wonderful analyses that we've heard, and you've heard, in this room and outside this room. How can we put them together so that Canada, quote unquote, can do something? Okay, great. So let me finish there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor. And I think you're right to remind us about the resource limitations and the capability limitations that Canada can have in the case of a Taiwan contingency. And it's, I think, one scenario that we can explore, but there's a lot more that was put on the table, particularly by even his comments on what are specific concrete areas where Canada and Japan can cooperate more as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Eve, you mentioned a possible kind of track 1.5, including with a third country on issues that might be relevant to Canada in terms of our China engagement or our India engagement. Again, Canadians in the room would know that our relations with those two big powers in the region are quite fraught. So, in Japan, of course, has very smooth relations with India and has had a better track record of having a functional relationship, if I may say so, with China. So that was one thing that you put on the table. You also mentioned that Canada and Japan can do more in Southeast Asia, particularly as Canada tries to make a big strategic bet on Southeast Asia as the region where we want to do more, engage more both in terms of trade, but also on other issues. Maybe if I could come to you first, on building a little bit more on that, especially now that you've heard some of the other comments from panelists, in terms of concrete things that can be done in this space. What are the opportunities, but also maybe what are the challenges? Because you began by saying that there's a lot of mutual congratulations and good sentiment, but that maybe now is kind of time to actually put a little bit more substance behind the good intentions. So maybe if I could turn to you first.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vinod, for those sharp questions. And to your prior question, I agree with Yoshi. I think if we did a spectrum of, of sense of crisis, sense of urgency, the stimulation to do real change, from 1 to 10, if Japan is an 8 or 9, Canada is much, much lower, 2, 3, and it's. A lot of it is because everyone else is doing certain things. To be even part of a functioning relation with the US, you must do those things too. So there's some of that. It's an external validation or legitimacy issue, as well as direct pressure. But we're nowhere near a consensus that this is about fundamental existential crisis or real threats and that sense of we need to mobilize resources, right? We're not there yet. So it's happening in a soft way. But if we think really now for your second question, what could be done, I can go again from what's doable first, what's doable in the midterm and what's long term. In the short term, I think an annual summit or track 1.5 that's much broader than just a little bilateral meeting to really discuss those things would have huge impact. I've witnessed what a track 1.5 can do. There is one, but happening now between Canada and France over those questions, and a lot was happening there. It should be obvious that Japan is the #1 ally in the Indo-Pacific, and so, well, apart from the US, but there is really room for it mobilizes so many bureaucracies and so many players and thinkers that it really accelerates, and that's doable, right? That can be done next year. The next on the doability would be anything around thinking of the economic order, economic security, supply chains, critical minerals. I mean, there's a lot of those discussions already, but they could be a strategic unit in the PMO with a lot more coordinating capacity, working with key allies. And then thinking also contingency on the global economic order. That, Canada is an economic superpower, and energy superpower critical, so this is where there's strength, right? It's just about, so much of our system is focused on domestic politics, on, it's reflective policy making based on public opinion. It's time to be more strategic, right, and have the right institution. Hopefully, it would also be it would be multi-party. We want a multi-party consensus to build that kind of consensus like there is in Japan. There was a very, very good point from Adam. There's a broad consensus in the within the LDP, but even beyond the LDP on a lot of what's happening. We don't have this in Canada, so that would be the critical piece, right? We need this. And then when you get to defense, we're doing what's doable now, which is using the assets we have, and there's very interesting cooperation on also illegal fishing detection, on flying mission even out of Hokkaido, but we just don't have assets. So that's the long-term stuff. I mean, also, looking at this, there's no way the US is not going to come very hard on Canada very soon. So why wait? Right? This is kind of losing autonomy. It's actually a question of independence, autonomy, and sovereignty. That the question for Canada, the real threat for Canada is if one day the US feels we're either a threat or dead weight. That's the only thing that can really threaten Canada. And it's better to anticipate and therefore be a full player. And then, the natural place for Canada would be the Arctic and I guess the Indo-Pacific, because the Atlantic is well covered by Europeans and Americans. So I think it will end up happening, but it will happen in a crisis way, under events, and it would make sense to really have a strategic unit again, and multi-partism to anticipate a little more. So we need also more foresight. I'm struck, how much of Ottawa functions on autopilot and repeating. The thing is, Canada repeats a belief in the liberal international order and Francis Fukuyama, 1990. And they believe it. The problem is the world has changed. And so the conceptual change has not penetrated Ottawa yet. And that limits the capacity to really anticipate. Whereas in the next few years, we're going to have dramatic change. It's going to be an age of disruption. And we're not ready. That's pretty much.
I think we also want to draw folks in the room. I know there are a number of current diplomats and scholars, as well as former ambassadors to the region who have a lot to offer. So I'll come to you in about 5 minutes. But first, I wanted to bring in Christy and Adam one more time. So you just mentioned kind of from the Canadian perspective what kind of we can be doing, but maybe Christy, from Japan's perspective, as Japan is looking at like-minded allies, you sort of mentioned both the doubling down on multilateralism, but also these mini-lateral like-minded groups that Japan is now finding itself a member of, with India, with Australia, with the US, with others in Southeast Asia. What would Japan be looking to Canada to have Canada add value to those? We in Canada, of course, are painfully aware that we're absent from many of these mini-lateral groupings that are now emerging. So what would be attractive from Japan's perspective? And then, Adam, I'll go straight to you to save time. Right after that would be what, again, if you look around, compared to other allies like Australia and others, what would the US like to see Canada do in the region? So maybe, Christy, we could start with you.
Sure. So before I get to that, just to answer your earlier question about urgency, I definitely don't think that Canada has the greatest sense of urgency as Japan, but I think also, to be fair, not many other countries do. And so
Geography
I think that,
matters.
Right, it really does. And so I think that if you look at some of these challenges, Japan is literally on the geographic front lines of that. And they've also been thinking about it for far longer than a lot of other countries have, because if you think about just vulnerabilities associated with economic interdependence with China, Japan has had issues since the mid-2000s with anti-Japanese protests. There was an incident with the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands in 2010 that was, very disturbing and caused some trade disruption in rare earths. So, Japan is, I think, one of the countries that has the highest sense of urgency and has been thinking about the longest. And I think, in fact, these differences in sense of urgency are one of the greatest challenges that we have to coalition building, because I think that a lot of countries, it's not that they aren't concerned, it's just, are they concerned enough to actually prioritize this and go forward and potentially take losses by alienating some other countries, right? So I think that that's kind of the question. And being in Hawaii, we talk a lot to people from Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands, and they're not entirely convinced a lot of times about kind of this narrative about threat from China and all these kinds of things. They have other existential problems related to development and climate change. So they're not really, in terms of how they prioritize their issues, there are other things that seem more concrete and urgent to them. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it is a key problem that's not unique just to Canada. It really is one of the key questions of coalition building and trying to get at these problems. For your question about mini-laterals, I think that, I think we're in a time when there's a dearth of good ideas in some ways. So I think that mini-laterals can often be good pilots and incubators for things. I think for Canada, I think supply chain resilience is a good kind of discussion. So I know that there are politics around energy, but there are a lot of advantages for Japan in critical minerals cooperation, for example, areas where everyone knows that it would be better to diversify trade and investment in all kinds of production into multiple locations, and I think there are opportunities to do that. I think that in other ways, Japanese investment in Canada might make sense strategically due to USMCA, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there. Just getting really concrete about what are our vulnerabilities, how could we reduce those by investing in Canada, and trying to triangulate. I think also, it's difficult in the mini-laterals because with the international order, we're talking about kind of big principles and things like this. But to the extent that mini-laterals can help us work out positions that we can then go to broader institutions and already have positions worked out, I think that's really good. So particularly there are the areas we're worried about that are very established, like trade or the maritime. But there are also areas like cyber, for example, or AI, where rules are being developed right now, right? So if Canada and the U.S. and Japan and other countries can get on board with these are very complicated things, but if they can have consensus amongst themselves, then they can take that position to other larger venues. So I think that both as kind of a testing ground and as the more kind of concrete planning implementation, there is some benefit to the mini-laterals.
Fantastic, thank you. Adam?
Okay, thank you. A lot to respond to. I think on the question of whether the IPS, Canada's IPS, is a peacetime document, it should be a peacetime document. The strategy should be designed to maintain peace and stability. And what it takes to maintain that peace and stability, or if you want to use the term the status quo, should not be static. It should adapt to evolving external circumstances. And so what I find most striking about what's been happening in Japan, and this is not just a story of the last 2 years, it's important to note that, but it's especially pronounced the last 2 years, and especially accessible to non-Japan experts the last 2 years, is that Japan's response is due in significant part to an assessment that the world is changing, the region is changing, and the balance of power in the Western Pacific is changing. And even if official positions on things like Taiwan's legal status don't change, Japan and others, I think, are increasingly judging that the way they talk about things, how vocal they are about concerns about peace and stability, and what's necessary to sustain the status quo may be changing. Canada's IPS refers to China, and I'm quoting here, as a disruptive actor, and also calls on deepening security partnerships. But at least in the defense base, which is what I primarily pay the most attention to, so perhaps I'm just revealing my own biases here. But it's not clear what Canada is now doing to bolster deterrence. And it's not the case that Canada or the U.S. or anybody else should come up with a strategy that is overly militarized. This is a very complicated challenge, also lots of opportunities. And going back to Christy's earlier point, it's complicated, and the strategy should reflect that. But based on my quick Googling, it seems like Canada's defense budget is going down rather than up, which is interesting. So you asked about concrete things that could be done. I think one place to start would be to increase rather than decrease defense spending. Not as an end in itself, but to create more options for Canada to play a more assertive role as the Canadian people decide is in Canada's best interest. A lot of times, and I've just completed a book manuscript on U.S. allies in the Taiwan Strait, what's quite striking is how the discussion about the region or the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere is framed differently in different capitals and by different actors. Sometimes it's seen almost entirely through the lens of alliance management, right? The U.S. wants us to do X, we have to be a good ally, therefore we should try to figure out a way to do X. But a lot of times it's framed as this is in our interest because peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is in our interests, and regardless of all the very complicated political questions related to that, perhaps most fundamentally it's about peace and stability in this extremely important economic region being maintained, to ensure that the regional and global trading system persists in a way that's in Canada's interest, in the US interest, in China's interest, and certainly in Taiwan's interest. So I think that's a conversation that perhaps could be a little bit more advanced. I think if there's more capability, if there's more resources, that allows for more presence, more opportunities to signal, even in peacetime, that we have a stake in peace and stability. And we've seen that happen in terms of the public rhetoric. But here, my standard of comparison is not and should not be the United States. Right? It's more other US treaty allies. And I think in this regard, what's been most fascinating to track over the last few years is the way in which some key players that I wouldn't expect to be super forward-leaning on some of these questions, like the European Union, are in fact leading. And we're seeing individual nation states in Europe peg their policies to, well, the EU said this and we subscribe to that. I think that's important to note. I was very active on it. And this, let's see, what was it called? The 6 shared priorities between Canada and Japan.
Yes.
Right. Hard security seems to be missing from this, which is, to an American eye, is quite remarkable. So let's shift the focus away from that. What's another concrete thing that Canada could do? And I'm not the first person to raise this, but I think it's an important one. The pressures that Taiwan faces are not just in the military domain. There's disinformation, there's misinformation, but also it's about economic resilience. And I think in this regard, right, Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy says it wishes to deepen ties with Taiwan and support its resilience. We had this really, really important bilateral investment agreement inked last December, which was great to see. And Canada is now CPTPP Commission Chair. Right? There are obviously a lot of complicated factors to consider, but Canada is in a unique situation this year to really support Taiwan's accession, which Japan is very publicly and unabashedly in support of. I think continuing quietly or very publicly to signal to the U.S. that its departure from TPP was, I'm in print saying, strategic malpractice. I think I stand by that statement, and I think it's gotten even more compelling over time. And I also think there are smaller things that Canada could do. Don't know how many folks in the room have heard of the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. Well, originally it was started at the end of the Obama administration as a bilateral framework for creating a platform for Taiwan to share its expertise with the world. It's done an incredible job. Japan joined as a formal member in 2019, I think. Australia joined as a formal member in 2021. Well, 2023 passed without another dance partner at the table. That's not to say that other governments aren't involved. They're showing up to the meetings, they're contributing in those ways, but I think symbolically it sends an important signal if a like-minded ally like Canada were to join in. I think that's something to think.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
No, that's really, really great. I'm glad you spent so much time on Google. Clearly excellent ideas in terms of what Canada can do, notably as an economic superpower. You mentioned CPTPP. I'm happy to know that that is definitely an area of priority, both for the foundation, but I also know for some other folks who are in the room in terms of what can Canada do as part of its leadership of the Commission this year and how to deal with the thorny issue of the China-Taiwan membership, the kind of the creative solutions and pathways, as well as obviously strengthening the actual agreement and making sure that all the economies are getting as much benefit from it as possible. So that's definitely an area, and you're right to point out the hard security limitations, but there's a lot more that Canada can be doing, even in the other spheres, notwithstanding the fact that it's unlikely that tomorrow the math on our defense spending will change drastically. But we have a little bit. A final word of thank you to Simon Fraser for being a co-host of this event and to the government of Japan for their generous sponsorship. So thank you again, and please join me in thanking our panelists.